A cicada sings against the aging oak tree. Quietly, it dies. That's a haiku I wrote about cicadas because this episode is all about cicadas. Welcome to Wild Connection, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Vertelen. I'm a scientist and author that studies animal behavior. I'm passionate about animals and exploring the complexity of their lives, their intelligence, relationships, families, social connections, and emotions. I also love helping people reconnect with nature to live better lives. This podcast is about you, other animals, and how we're all connected in this wild and crazy thing called life. Cover your ears because this next month is going to be especially loud for some of you. You say cicada, I say cicada, but what some people are going to say is it's dang loud out there. That's because there's a historic emergence of cicadas happening right now. There are over 3,400 species in the world, but in the United States, we have something special. We have periodical cicadas. There are 15 broods, and they run on 13 and 17-year cycles. Check out the YouTube video for some great insight into these insect lovers of prime numbers. This year is the first time in 221 years that broods 19 and 13 are coming out at the same time. Just how many are coming out? Oof. Scientists are thinking in the trillions. The first wave is hitting northern Louisiana, southern Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and northern Georgia, all the way up into the western part of South Carolina. Then, as temperatures warm up, the rest are going to come above ground in central North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, the northern part of Arkansas, followed by southern Missouri, southern Illinois, and western Kentucky. If your head isn't spinning, the rest of them are going to appear throughout central and northern Missouri and Illinois, part of Indiana, southern Wisconsin, and all the way over to Iowa. You could try counting the cicadas in your head to go to sleep, but if you live where they are, you may be in for some sleepless nights. Before we get started, a little humble ask. If you're liking the show, give us a like, share it with someone. And if you're feeling really generous, give us a review. All of that helps me keep this podcast going and landing some really special guests. Little quick update. I'm heading back to Uganda I might already be in Uganda by the time this airs. And we're doing a really cool project with students where we are exploring the impact of microplastics on wildlife. And this was with generous funding from the U.S. State Department through the embassy in Kampala. If you want to find out what's going on with that project, head over to www.jennifervertelen.com. Sign up for the newsletter. You can also follow me on Instagram at RealDrJen, where I'll be posting some photos of the project. This week is a reboot of an episode I did in 2021 with Dr. Floyd Shockley. Even though we were talking about Brood 10, I thought it would be great to replay this episode for you since we are now in the midst of a historic emergence that only happens every 221 years. Hey, everybody. I want to welcome Dr. Floyd Shockley to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to talk with you.
Gosh, I am so thrilled that you were able to make time because I know that you're incredibly busy, especially with this cicada extravaganza that's gripping the nation. Before we talk about that, I really would love for folks to learn a little bit more about who you are and what you do. So how did you decide to become an entomologist?
Well, so that's actually a pretty interesting story. I wasn't one of those kids who, grew up collecting butterflies and then became an entomologist later. I did always have an appreciation for nature. I grew up on a small farm in rural Missouri. And so, I spent a lot of time outdoors. But I really didn't become an entomologist until much later. I got a chance to take a couple of courses during my undergrad that had a lot of insect focus to it. And it was during that time that I sort of found my interest. And then I pursued that into a master's degree and then finally my PhD. And I actually changed sort of the type of entomology I did between those. So mine is sort of an interesting story about how I became an entomologist. But I would say I was always a naturalist at heart. And it wasn't until college that I really started to focus in on insects.
That's great. And, I'm curious because one of the things that I like for the audience to know is how everyone, in their own way connects to nature. And so it's true that some of the other entomologists that I've had on the show, they grew up collecting insects and they always, were interested in them. And so I love that you have this sort of broader appreciation when you were a kid for nature. How do you connect now with nature?
Oh, very much the same. I mean, I really love, being outside, because of my research. I've gotten opportunities to travel and collect both domestically as well as internationally. So, there's really something special about getting outside, sort of experiencing nature where it happens, as opposed to, it's very easy to sort of fall into the habit when you work at a big museum like ours. I could probably spend my whole career and never go back outside again because we have so much material and so many stories sort of locked in the collection and able to be accessed. But I really find one of the things that sort of makes me a little bit different than some of the other, scientists is, I have a really strong focus on wanting to know what insects are doing in nature. That's something that sometimes isn't always captured on a museum specimen label, right? You don't always see kind of what it was doing. Were there other insects or other animals nearby? What was the habitat like? Were there particular plants involved? And that's something that you only really see if you're physically out there, right? Mm-hmm. You just don't sort of capture that really important biological information, on a really small specimen label in a museum collection. So, I really feel strongly about that, and I always have. And so I get outside as much as I can. And of course I hunt cryptic insects. I work on my own research focuses on fungus feeding beetles. And so they're often hard to obtain. They don't come to lights and things like other insects can be captured with traps and things. So I have to actively go and get them where they are because they don't come to the standard traps and things we use.
That's great. I really appreciate what you were saying because it almost seems like, and I'm, as a fellow scientist, that the natural history part of things has, sometimes been forgotten in the pursuit of some really detailed, highly specific kinds of questions, which are also important. But that broader picture of what animals are doing, where they are, what's around them. So it's wonderful that you focus on that. And, you have a pretty important position as the collections manager for the Department of Entomology at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And you said you have, you could spend your life there with the stories that are locked up in the museum. Can you give us a sense of what the scale is of the collection that you manage?
Sure. So first thing I'd like to point out is, like with lots of these large collections, it's not just me. I have a lot of partners in this endeavor. It would be impossible given the size of our collection. So our collection is a little over 35 million specimens, making it the largest insect collection in the world. We are one of what's considered the big three departments in natural history. Between us, we have over 100 million specimens in just three departments. And that actually comprises most of the Smithsonian holdings is our three departments. We have about 134,000 drawers of pinned insects in the collection, over 33,000 jars of specimens that are preserved permanently in alcohol, about 23,000 slide boxes of microscopic slides, as well as dissection mounts that are often critical for identification and description of new species, and well over 500,000 specimens that are actually in envelopes. So they're preserved dry, but they're not pinned, and that's like our dragonfly collection. Some of our butterfly collection is housed that way. So we're really large, and we're actually spread out across 11 different facilities, 3 in the main downtown, Washington metropolitan area. And then we also have partners at 8 other institutions around North America, where they have our entire holdings of certain taxa. And they help us. Those are offsite curatorial partnerships, and they help us by curating the collections that they have there, as well as hosting visitors, loaning material to researchers. But most of our material is housed in the 3 facilities in the DC area, with, of course, the downtown museum being the largest portion of that.
Wow. I already know I'm going to have you back to talk about insect biodiversity and your research on the fungus-seeking beetles, because, as someone who has studied vertebrate social mammals for most of their career, I am discovering and learning so much about the other worlds of things. And insects and beetles in particular are really diverse. So you've got one of the largest collections, 35 million. You're surrounded by insects, but that's a drop in the bucket to what's about to happen with cicadas.
That's true.
Right?
That's absolutely true.
And so first, let's help everyone understand, what is a cicada?
So cicadas are one family of the order Hemiptera. These are the true bugs. Now, not every insect is a bug. Bugs are a very specific order of insects. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, for one, and that sort of sets them apart from most other insects. And cicadas are among the largest physically. They're not the most diverse, but they're some of the largest physically of the true bugs. Here in North America, they really are the largest of our true bugs. Some of the annual cicadas that we have get really quite large. They're 2 to 3 inches long, and so for a lot of people, especially those who live in cities, they can be very striking. And even the periodical cicadas, which are 25 to 35% smaller than the annual cicadas, will be large compared to most insects folks in cities might be used to seeing. So they're going to be very obvious. So cicadas are really set apart. They've got sort of a broad-shouldered appearance. They've got a wide head with wide set eyes. And again, they have that piercing, sucking mouth part that sticks down, and it actually runs between their front legs when they're not using it. And so, adult cicadas typically use those for feeding a little bit, but most of the feeding is actually done in the nymph stage, and that's all done underground. That's one of the weird things about this group is we actually don't see the majority of the life cycle. We only see the end when they're all coming out, trying to find mates, lay eggs, and die. We're seeing a very short amount of what can be a very long life cycle.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that because you said something really interesting. You said there's annual cicadas and then there's periodical cicadas. So how many different species are there sort of globally and then here in North America? And how many are how are they distributed across being annual versus sort of periodical?
Okay, so let's start with the global numbers. There's between 3,000 and 4,000 species worldwide, which is actually small for insect diversity. I mean, there are some genera of beetles that have almost that many species in it, but it's a really decent number. Within North America, it's right at 200 species. And almost all of those are considered annual cicadas. So only 7 species of periodical cicadas exist, and those are split into 3 species that are 17-year cycle synchronized and 4 species that are 13-year cycle synchronized. And then it's just those 7. And then all of the rest, 192 or 193, are considered annual cicadas. But before we move on, I just want to kind of mention they're called annual cicadas, but they're not truly annual cicadas. They do not complete their life cycle in 1 year. They, depending on the species, annual cicadas take anywhere from 2 years to 5 years to complete their life cycle. But the difference is they are not synchronized like periodical cicadas, so you don't get a mass emergence. So some come out every year, right?
Yeah.
Across the distribution of whatever species you're talking about. So you see them every year, but you are not seeing them complete their whole life cycle within that 1 year. And that's really important for people to kind of realize, because that's one of the things that separates the annuals from the periodicals is the synchronized life cycle, right? It's not just that they're underground for 17 years in the periodical cicadas, it's that they are also synchronized to all come out all at once. And that doesn't happen in the annual cicadas.
I appreciate that distinction because, as I was researching for our talk, I was like, well, I remember seeing cicadas last year, and which one did I see? And obviously it wasn't these, that are emerging this year. But I've always found it a bit mysterious because I knew that they may not, like groups of them or piles of them or trillions of them may not come out every year. So I didn't know that there was this, real distinction and that the synchronicity is what sets them apart. So I really appreciate that. You mentioned the life cycle of cicadas. So let's talk about that a little bit, right? Like, because for the periodical ones, the ones that we're seeing now, these ones are on the 17-year, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So the big emergence that's happening across a really large portion of the eastern U.S. Is brood 10. It's called brood 10, not brood X. A lot of people in the media keep mispronouncing it, and it looks. I guess it's because cicadas seem mysterious and alien, and the periodical cicada songs kind of sound like a UFO landing. So I can sort of get it, but it's actually all of the broods that exist are numbered using Roman numerals. So it just so happens that when they got to brood 10, it looks like brood X. So people have been mispronouncing it, but it's really brood 10.
Okay.
And so, yes, these guys are set to a 17-year cycle. And this particular brood includes one representative of all 3 of the species groups that exist within the periodical cicadas. So the 3 species are Magicicada septemdecim, Magicicada cassinii, and Magicicada septemdecula. And all 3 will be out at the same time. And all 3 will be trying to find, mates of their particular species. So it may sound like an overwhelming large cacophony or it's actually called a chorus when they all get together and they start singing simultaneously.
Yeah.
But there's actually 3 different species singing simultaneously, and the females can tell the males from her species apart from the others. So we can't. It all just sounds like noise, but they can tell the difference.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about, the males and all the effort they put in to attracting the ladies. But I'm just one thing I'm wondering, since it's called brood 10 and not brood X, is that because scientists have been tracking for about 170 years and they're named by their emergence, or why 10?
Well, so the numbering system actually is more of a recent thing. It came around in 1898, was when the brood numbers were first established by an entomologist named Marlott. There were pre-existing naming schemes. Different entomologists, including some of the more famous, like C.B. Riley, who's a really well-known entomologist, and others had come up with their own naming schemes. And so one of the sort of reasons for Marlotte to develop the system was to do away with all that so that everybody was using the same numbering scheme, because they already knew that they had a limited number of species. They were tracking the same species set to different cycles. And so by giving them Roman numerals, it simplified how we refer to them. So everybody was referring to the same brood with the same number. And that wasn't the case prior to his publishing of his work. There were about 7 different existing things. So the first recorded emergence of brood 10 actually goes back a lot further than that. Tracks back to 1715 was the first recording of the emergence of brood 10. But the first recording of any periodical cicada brood actually goes back even further than that, to 1633 in the Plymouth colony. About a year or two after the establishment of the colony, one of the periodical cicada broods in the area emerged. And of course, they thought it was a biblical plague, attacking them. And, the Native Americans in the area had experienced them for, many, many generations, and of course, because the mass emergence has all types of impacts depending on who you are. If you're not a scientist, it can seem very plague-like, but of course, they're relatively benign. As far as large emergence events go, cicadas are just about the best one you can have, because they're almost completely harmless. They can't bite, they can't sting. The males can't do anything. And the only thing females can do is cause small amounts of damage to really young trees, like saplings, less than a year old, because of their oviposition behavior. But otherwise, they're great. So, we have a long history of recording them. And once we sort of establish that we've got a brood, it's been tracked pretty much ever since. So we have a lot of information about brood 10 because we've been tracking it basically since the early 1700s.
Wow, that's incredible, and it speaks to the power of this sort of continuity of science, and how we learn so much by long-term data, right? However it's collected, and that's not always possible. You mentioned
that's actually one of the reasons why we lean really heavily on museum collections to help us, because, if you happen to be a researcher working on periodical cicadas, you may get to experience 2, possibly 3 emergences, in your career of any particular brood. And so you can gather all of your research and you can kind of do, distributional mapping and stuff. But ultimately, if there are things happening to the brood, you're not going to be the one to discover it. The next generation is going to be the one to take your data and continue moving it forward. And that's been the way it's been. Since those early times here in America, naturalists were recording this stuff and passing it, forward into the future. So
and I think a separate issue, just a little tangent, is a lot of museums have experienced reduced funding, and I think that it's so important for people to know how critical these collections and the information that is contained in the museums is to even making new discoveries. It's not just always looking backwards. It's finding out really new things that can change or upend some of our ideas about things. You mentioned oviposition, and I just want to let everybody know that and make sure I'm correct. That's where the females are laying their eggs.
That's right. So when the female cicada, this is still a ways out, by the way. This is the last thing that happens in the emergence. After the females have found a male and they've mated and her eggs have developed, she has a really powerful ovipositor. It's kind of saw-like. It's got a blade on it. She'll use that to cut a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch long groove into the surface of small limbs. Usually she's looking for stuff 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch in diameter at the most. and she'll cut a groove, and then she will lay her eggs inside that groove. And that groove provides some physical protection to the eggs, because the eggs won't actually hatch for 6 to 8 weeks. So they're just sitting there more or less exposed if she puts it on the surface. So by putting it in that groove, it kind of protects them a little bit. And it also exposes some of the tree fluids, so that when the nymphs do hatch, they can take a quick meal before they have to make their way to the ground. And often they'll just drop to the ground. They're very light because they're very small. And they'll begin the process of digging in, where they'll live underground for 2 to 17 years, depending on what species.
Okay, so these nymphs, I mean, they're basically, what do they use to get into? Do they have special structures that help them burrow into the ground? And then what do? Do they just go to sleep? Do they?
No, they're actually alive and active the entire time. These guys aren't. They're not going into any kind of long-term hibernation or senescence. Basically, they're not shutting down. They are active. They're moving around in some cases. Cicada nymphs have really powerful digging legs. The front legs are really enlarged, and that is for digging, right? And so that changes when they become an adult. They take sort of all that muscle, and they move it into the thorax to power the wings, so that they can fly, right? But as nymphs, they're not flying, so they put it all into those front legs, and they're digging down. As the first instar nymphs, they don't go terribly deep because they're really so small, and their mouth parts are so delicate that they're not big enough yet to tap into tree roots, which is what they'll spend most of their life feeding on. So they'll start off on grasses, really tender grass roots, and then they'll move up to slightly larger plants. And so they've got to move underground. So they're digging these tunnels. And then by the time they reach their second instar stage, they're big enough to start making their way to their final host. And they'll find a tree root, and they'll tap in, and then they'll basically feed on that same tree root for the rest of their life cycle until they're ready to emerge and molt into the adult.
And okay, and so then all that, when they go into, do they molt before they come out?
Yeah, they'll molt several times underground.
Okay.
So there's multiple stages underground. Some of them are actually really critical. The second instar is critical in the periodical cicadas, because that's sort of what sets them. There's a physiological change that delays their life cycle and creates that long 17-year underground thing. And that happens in the second instar nymph. But then they'll go through a few more molts underground until they're finally in the last instar molt. And that's the big one. That's the one that people will be seeing. Actually, we're already seeing them emerging now. And they're slightly smaller than the adult will be.
Okay. And so let's talk about the males and all of the singing that they do, the choruses. So it's going to get pretty noisy out there.
It is. So like I said, some have already emerged. These are early. It happens all the time. You get a whole bunch that start to come up early. We haven't actually gotten to the wave yet. Okay. It'll be very obvious when the wave happens, because it'll suddenly go from a few hundred to thousands or millions in your backyard. So we'll know when that happens, and that hasn't happened yet. So they come up, and the males tend to be slightly ahead. They'll all molt, but they don't actually start singing for about a week after they've turned into the adult. They go up and they hang out in the trees, and they wait for anywhere from 3 days to a week, and then they'll start to sing. And then they'll sing for a week or so, and then you'll start to see lekking. And for your viewer or listeners that may not know what lekking is basically when you get large aggregations of the same sex all sort of forming together and trying to attract members of the opposite sex. And so that's when you'll see what's known as the choruses form. And that's when really large numbers of males of the same species will all start congregating together, and they will synchronize their songs to amplify their sound.
Right.
And that will be when it's really uncomfortable. It'll be sort of uncomfortable while they're just singing, just because, you won't be able to get away from it. But when these aggregations form, when these leks form, the sound can be really off-putting, almost painful, depending on how sensitive your hearing is. They'll reach or exceed 90 decibels. So it'll sound like a really loud lawnmower or a jackhammer. In some really dense areas, it's almost been likened to a loud rock concert or a jet engine firing up. So it'll be loud. You'll have to have the headphones on if you've got to be outside working in some of the areas where the numbers are really high.
Well, and hopefully people, will, since it won't go on forever, right? Hopefully people can understand, like, look, it's just the guys, they're trying to get the girls. It's like ladies' night. Lekking is like ladies' night at a club where, the males go somewhere where they think they're going to find females. And then they do something, they display, they sing, depending on the species. So these guys sing. And I want to circle back to something you said earlier, which is that there's going to be 3 different species coming out, and that their songs are actually slightly different so that the females know to hook up with the right kind of male. Do all the males of one species aggregate together and sing, or do all 3, will they mix in a lek and
typically
and
no. Yeah, you end up with concentrations of the same species. I mean, you might have a few males that end up in that, but when the song begins, they'll realize they're in the wrong one, and they'll move away from it because they're looking for the female of their sex.
Sure.
And she's not going to come to that song.
Right.
And it's not just the cicadas that can tell them apart. Actually, the song is different enough that you listening, if you listen to the 3 songs, they're very different from one another, and you can actually tell them apart if you sort of get yourself used to what the 3 songs are. You can tell them apart. That's actually, for many people, that's the easiest way to tell what species you have, is to listen to the song coming from the chorus rather than trying to catch one and identify it morphologically. Now, you can tell them apart, like looking at them. There are features that will help you separate the 3 species, but the song is the easiest, and you don't have to touch the cicada to tell which species you have.
So I'm wondering, because I could post it in the show notes. Are there recordings that people can listen to that can then help them? Because we're going to talk at the end a little bit about citizen science and the cicada safari map tool that people can get involved. But is there a way? I know, like the Cornell Ornithology has a library of all bird songs. Is there a library of insect songs?
There are several actual nice libraries that include the songs of all of the periodical cicadas, not just the 3 that are coming out in brood 10. And it also includes not just the mating call, but you can also hear distress calls sound slightly different. So, if a cicada is in trouble, or if you pick one up, it's going to stop singing its mating song, and it's going to make a very different sound, and it's trying to startle you. It's perceiving you as a predator, and it wants you to let it go. And so you can actually sample all of the sounds, through several of those websites that have recordings online. Yeah, they're readily available. If you Google the 3 species names that I said earlier, and song, there's multiple websites that you'll hit that will let you listen.
That's great. I'm going to make sure that's in the show notes. And before I sort of
and just to be clear, if you do like physical recording, you can tell. So if you look at audiographs of the song, they look very different. And they'll look very different and sound very different than our annual cicadas, which people are used to hearing more of the sort of a wee-oo sound that annual cicadas make. Periodicals make a totally different sound. So you can tell them apart. They're not overlapping in terms of time. Annual cicadas don't come out until later. in the summer. But that's probably the song that people are most familiar with because they didn't have to wait 17 years to hear it.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to think like where I was 17 years ago. And if I don't think I've ever been in a place that had this happen. And I don't.
Wow. This is my ninth experience, my ninth brood.
Wow.
So I've experienced 9 of them over the course of my career. And this is my second time with brood 10, although my first time I was in that southern population that's down around the Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee border.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I was for my PhD in 2004 when they were out. But this is the one here in the DC area is the densest concentration. It's the biggest cluster. So I'm super excited to sort of see what it's like at ground zero for brood 10.
Yeah.
Compared to the much smaller populations that we saw in 2004 in Georgia. So
that's incredible. So I was in New York in 2004, but at this time of year, I was in Flagstaff, Arizona, studying prairie dogs. So I don't think I've ever. There was one time in North Carolina. I was there from 2009 to 2016, where I feel like I saw there was something similar, but it wasn't like they were falling from the sky.
Well, that's another thing that would be good to sort of point out is, the broods are very predictable. We know when the big emergence is going to happen for each of the 15 existing broods, but there are what are known as stragglers that are out almost every year. These are often, it's kind of strange. So periodical cicadas sort of focus in on prime numbers, right? So, there's lots of speculation as to why prime numbers. We're not exactly, positive. I mean, it's obviously there's a genetic component to it. It's programmed genetically into each of the species, based on are they 17 or 13, but you get stragglers every year. So every single year there are some periodical cicadas out somewhere. Now they may be 1 year ahead or behind the main brood emergence, or they can be 4 years, ahead or behind. And of course, 4 minus 1 is 3, which is a prime number, right? So
correct.
And they don't really do anything in between. It's either 1 to 4 years before, 1 to 4 years behind, or right on time at 13 and 17. And it's just such a strange thing. And we actually think that probably that's how we ended up with 13 and 17, right? They're separated by the same number, right? You get enough of them out at, enough to mate and establish a large population. And suddenly you could have a different brood set to a different cycle than the main brood. And so we think that's probably how a lot of the broods that we currently know came into existence, probably very, very early on, right after the last glaciation event here in North America, which of course would have impacted especially the 17-year cicadas, which are distributed more northernly, versus 13 years, which tend to be more southern.
Okay.
17 years would have been really impacted by glaciation events, right? They would have had to sort of make their populations persist through glacial refuge areas, in small patches where the glacier didn't actually hit. And so a lot of the really strange sort of relictual distributions we see now are because of those glaciation events. And some of them are really quite strange. We also know that some of them now are being impacted by human behavior, right? We change land over from forest to agriculture. We basically exclude the cicadas that were there. We'll kill the nymphs usually by modifying the soil. We lay down a parking lot. They're not digging their way up through that. So now we're seeing modern changes in distributions based on human activity. But the cicadas are versatile. They'll find ways to sort of keep going. So, yeah.
Well, I hope so, because, they mate all at the same time when they come up. I mean, roughly, right? Over this period of a few weeks.
About 4 weeks. Yeah. 4 weeks. And then about another 2 weeks for the females to lay her eggs and and die, but most of the activity will be in a concentrated burst of about 4 weeks.
Right. And then all the adults die, which means, right, that there is a risk, a vulnerability that can a brood go extinct?
They can. And actually 2 already have. 2, there used to be 17 broods, 2 of them, which were limited to very small areas. Basically, they went extinct. One very, very early on, and then one as recently as like the 50s. So yeah, I'm just looking up here. So one brood went extinct in 1870, and one brood went extinct in 1954. So those were very small populations, only found in a very small area. There's also, we know, for instance, that New York, Long Island, used to have periodical cicadas from brood 10, but mostly because of human activity, they've been extirpated from the island. There's not very many, if any, now because of human activity. We've modified the landscape to the point that the population couldn't persist. Now, brood 10 isn't going anywhere. It's, it's the largest of the 17-year broods, and it's going to survive almost anything we throw at it.
Good.
There are small pockets where you get small populations that just can't make it, or we change the environment enough to where it's no longer hospitable for the nymphs to survive.
Right.
And the nymphs have a tough life anyway. That's another weird thing that people don't realize is periodical cicada nymphs experience a 98% mortality rate just over the first few years that they're in the ground. It's tough because you're small. You got to find just the right kind of roots. There's predators, there's pathogens in the soil. So what we're actually seeing every, like this year, the brood 10, this is only the 2% that survived from being laid as eggs in 2004. And it's still going to be like a trillion cicadas in some places.
So imagine, right? I mean, and that's a strategy, right? That many species and insects also can use because if mortality is really high, one strategy is to lay an overabundance of eggs to make sure that some portion survive. And with all the adults dying after, why do they die after they reproduce?
Well, because that's the only thing that they're doing. That's the only thing. So the adults in periodical, so in annual cicadas, sometimes the adults will feed, but in periodical cicadas, they don't feed as adults. So they might drink a little bit of water just to sort of, keep from getting dehydrated, but they're not eating anything. So 4 to 6 weeks is about how long it takes for, an animal to basically starve to death, right? So they're sort of in a race with time to just lay the eggs, and that's it. As a matter of fact, after the mating event, which will happen in the next 3 weeks, most of the males will already begin to die. So you'll see, the population ratio will change from roughly 50-50 to 75-25 to almost 100% females at the end of the emergence event, because the males would have already mated and they've fulfilled sort of their biological imperative.
Right.
With cicadas, they invest a huge amount in the nymphs, trying to get the nymphs in a place where they'll be able to survive. But they don't put very much into the adults lasting very long or surviving. That's just not part of their survival strategy.
Yeah.
And they come out in such huge numbers that, they overwhelm potential predators. It's predator satiation is the technical term when you get insects that emerge like this. And they're not the only ones. There are other things. Mayflies are well known to do it. Mm-hmm. There are other flies that also do that. Where the real investment is trying to get it, overwhelm populations of predators so that the species survive. And that's what they're doing. They're coming out in such huge numbers that it doesn't matter if every squirrel, possum, skunk, raccoon, dog, cat, coyote, or fox, birds can eat as many as they want until the point that they're absolutely bursting at the seams. And there's still so many cicadas left to reproduce that they can reproduce relatively unmolested by predators because they'll fill all of the bellies almost immediately.
Right.
So,
well, I mean, and that's a boon for all of those species. And we're going to talk about how it could also be a boon for humans in just a second. But I want to point out for everyone that, lots of species use this strategy, even mammals, right? So a lot of the antelope and where you see synchronized births where everybody's just having their babies all at once is a way to kind of flood the predator system so that there's going to be some individuals that survive. But of course, we don't see 1 trillion antelopes coming out at the same time. That would be a bit problematic. Before we talk about bugs on the menu, I wanted to just make a point because this has been a point of confusion. So I'd love to hear from you about this. So I just had Dr. Jeff Lockwood on the show, and he wrote this book called Locust. And he was saying that a lot of people confuse cicadas with locusts, which are actually grasshoppers. Do you think it's because of the sheer number that show up and that, is considered sometimes a biblical plague that there's this confusion?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it. I think, especially before we really had a lot of great sort of natural history and taxonomy to sort of help us sort this out, there was they're large. They're both large insects. Mm-hmm. They both make noise. They can arrive in really large populations. And so I can sort of see how people could make that intuitive leap. And even now that we know full well that cicadas are cicadas and locusts are grasshoppers, there are certain parts of the country where they are still using the common name locust for cicadas, even if they know that that's wrong. That's just what it's called, regionally. And so it still persists, but they're very different. Locusts, do in fact consume crops. They can bite. And so, when they show up in large numbers, that can be a real problem. And I think, because a lot of early settlers, when they moved here, a lot of sort of their perceptions were based in, biblical references. And, the Bible isn't really that great at sort of describing diversity. It's very limited and it's very focused, right? In many of the stories, they're not doing it to make a field guide, right, to the insect or whatever. So it would have been very difficult, I think, for writers of different chapters of the Bible to try and separate a cicada from a grasshopper, in any kind of meaningful way, and that just sort of persists into modern times.
Okay.
But it does still happen a lot. But I appreciate the opportunity to make it clear that these are very different things, and we don't actually have locusts like the kind that you're talking about in the Bible. Those are mainly African. Mm-hmm. And Middle Eastern. They don't really occur here. We used to have a locust, the Rocky Mountain locust, but it actually has gone extinct for a variety of reasons. And so we don't really have locusts in the same sort of plague level that we used to have. So
yeah. Well, and I also want people to recognize that it's not the same because these are not harmful. They're not going to destroy crops or gardens or leave a scorched earth behind, with what's like right now is going on in Kenya. There's been a locust swarm that's been moving. I think it started in the Middle East and it's hit Ethiopia, and that's very different. And because they're big and because they're sort of interesting looking. I'm going to say interesting looking, but other people may think alien looking. If they're confused about that, they might kill them and, just for the sake of killing them, or be afraid that they're going to destroy things. Now,
well, and in many cases, people are already saying, I've seen these popping up in my garden, and that's really only because you put your garden somewhere where there were trees 17 years ago. They didn't invade your garden. You put your garden where they happen to be living. And so it's really kind of important to sort of think of it from a cicada's long-term view.
Sure.
They don't know the difference, right? It might have been a full forest when they went in the ground, and they're just feeding on whatever roots they happen to find. So,
right.
If they're popping up in your garden, they're not going to bother your garden plants at all. They're not going to lay their eggs in that. That's just not part of their life cycle. It just so happens you put a garden where they went into the ground. So, they're going to be gone relatively soon. And the dead bodies of the adults are going to, decay and sort of return a lot of nitrogen and a lot of calcium and other important minerals that the trees will then take back up, right? The plants will take all that back up. And it's a wonderful sort of cycle, right? They put so much into getting to the adult stage, and then they mate, and then they basically give it right back to the plants, everything that they took from in a relatively short period of time, only a couple of weeks, and their bodies will all be gone and will have disintegrated. So
sure. And so they're going to feed your garden. And in many places, bugs, including cicadas, feed people. So let's just talk about that real quick before I let you go. So predators aren't the only ones that feast on them. And for people might think this is strange, but for people around the world in many places, eating bugs or other insects is quite a normal part of their diet. And
absolutely. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations did a report back in 2013 that focused on the eating of insects globally. And they estimated that over 2 billion people worldwide consume insects and other arthropods as a regular part of their normal diet, not as a novelty, which is how it has kind of been reduced to in Western nations like the U.S., Canada, most of Europe, where we might take crickets and dip them in chocolate or put mealworms on a pizza, right, to try and get people to eat insects. They're eating them regularly as a part of a nutritional diet. And insects are really great. They're high protein, low fat, low carb, gluten free. They don't have huge expenditures in terms of space, so they don't have the same sort of environmental impacts that traditional livestock can sometimes have. And the inputs in terms of the amount of food and water that you have to give insects, if you're running like a large commercial farming thing, is much less.
Sure.
And you get much higher output in terms of protein production per animal when you move into sort of concentrated agriculture. And you can stack crickets in bins 12 feet high if you wanted to, and you couldn't take cows and stack them 12 feet high. So the footprint is really quite small. But as you say, that same report that I just mentioned puts it at 80% of nations in the world have regular insect and other terrestrial arthropod consumption as a staple part of the diet, not as a novelty, not as a dare, but as a regular part of the diet. And they eat everything. We're talking about tarantulas, scorpions, lots of different kind of insects, especially larvae, are consumed in lots of different places. They have different cultures focus on different species. Sure. But globally, there's at least 1,900 species that are regularly consumed as part of the normal human diet. And it's only here in the U.S. where it's sort of this gross thing that, why would I do that? Insects are gross and dirty, which is absolutely incorrect.
Correct.
People have no problem eating shrimp and crab and lobster. And these are bottom feeding carrion feeders, right? So, which would you rather have? A nice herbivore like a cicada, right? Or a shrimp just that spent its entire life eating a dead fish, right? I mean,
right. So right. What goes in must come out,
there seems to be like a selective acceptance to eating some arthropods, but not others.
Well, and a lot of that is also, a lot of cultural and historical sort of communities were built around, lobster, shrimp, harvesting or crab. And So, and I actually think it's more ecologically sound to eat insects rather than use pesticides all over and kill them all. But speaking of nutritious, I mean, could we say that a cicada is like an egg with legs?
No, actually, they're far better for you than an egg. Lower cholesterol, lower in saturated fats that we know are bad for your heart.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually much better for you than an egg with legs.
Okay.
Think about the leanest piece of meat, a piece of salmon or something that. And now imagine that you've got a billion of them that you can just sort of grab and use for almost any dish.
Right. Can you do it? Can you do it after they die? Can you eat them after they already die? No.
Okay. I mean, and that, would you eat roadkill? I mean, some people, maybe some places might eat roadkill, but no, I mean, it's a dead animal. So,
sure.
It's begun to decay.
Okay.
So you don't want to eat them when they're dead. If they're still alive, they're totally edible. All life stages of the periodical cicadas are edible.
Okay.
The eggs are edible. The nymph is edible. The teneral adult, that's the white, still soft adult right after it molts, is edible. But you can still eat the full-grown adults.
Okay.
Until hardened. Now, most people, when they consume them, they take the wings and the legs off. Just, I don't know, it feels weird for them. They're totally edible too. You can eat them. They tend to be a little too crunchy and a little sort of off-putting to a Western palate to crunch down on a whole cicada, but you can. They are 100% edible. You want to sex them if you can. If you want to dabble with this. Males don't actually have very much meat by the end of their life cycle once they're an adult. Males, most of their abdomen, for instance, is actually hollow space, and they use that to amplify the song, right? They only have to have basically their testes so they can mate with females. They've got blood supply, but otherwise it's mostly hollow, right? So if you cook those, they're mainly adding sort of crunch, right? They're adding a texture to whatever the dish is. Females, however, they have, their abdomen is full of eggs. And so, you get a much more pleasing and succulent experience with a female. And you can tell them apart by flipping them over. The ovipositor on the female is very conspicuous on the abdomen. It's a really dark, shiny strip right down the middle of the abdomen towards the tip of the abdomen, and males don't have those. And so when you flip them over side by side, it's very obvious. When you have a male, he just has sort of a dome-shaped structure at the end, but the female's abdomen comes down to a sharp point, right? Because she's going to use that to push into those into the limbs. And so it's very easy to tell them apart. And once you get used to it, you can actually do it without flipping them over. Just walk up to a tree. You'll be able to tell, this is a male and this is a female.
Okay. I'm gonna try that. Well, I don't know if I'll see any where I am at the moment, but I think it is important to point out, because I was reading this and I want to make sure it's true, that people with shellfish allergies should not eat cicadas. Is that correct?
Well, it's partially correct. So it's specifically those with crustacean shellfish. So if you have an allergic reaction to shrimp, to crabs, anything like that, yes, you can. There are a couple of proteins that are found in the muscle tissue that are the same as those that are found in crustacean shellfish. And those have been shown to be reactive and cause an allergic reaction in sensitive people.
Okay.
And the chitin itself that they use for their exoskeleton is essentially the same. It's the same structural thing. So if you're eating the outside of the animal, like you do sometimes with shrimp, where you eat the whole thing, you can have a reaction because the chitin is essentially the same.
Okay.
So we recommend, if you have a known shellfish allergy, there's not that many documented cases of someone who had a crustacean shellfish allergy, then ate a cicada and had an anaphylactic reaction. There are a few, but not too many. But we always sort of recommend people, just make good choices. If you have that, Is it really worth it to you to try to eat a cicada? Probably not. You'll have to live vicariously through others.
Okay.
But yeah, for everyone else, bon appetit.
Right. Well, and I'm going to try to find a recipe. I don't know if you have a favorite one that you can share.
Well, actually, unfortunately, since this is audio only, your listeners won't get a chance to do it. But there's actually cookbooks specifically for cicadas. There's a number of these that are cicada specific, and that's all they include is recipes for how to prepare cicadas. And some of these are really fantastic. A lot of them are sometimes simple. Cicada nymphs and teneral adults are great, just sautéed in butter, and you can use them in lots of different dishes. But
butter makes everything good. I don't care what anybody says.
All types of things. You can make tacos. There's a cicada and saffron risotto in here. Deep fried cicadas. You could roast them and drizzle a little bit of honey or something on them. Around here, a lot of folks around here are gonna season them with Old Bay and use them sort of interchangeably with shrimp, because that's something we do here in the Mid-Atlantic. Right?
Yeah, you could do a cicada paella.
You absolutely can.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I put links to these some of these cookbooks on the show notes for people to find and maybe explore. And there's literally dozens of cookbooks for insects in general. About a half dozen cookbooks that are just cicadas, but there's literally thousands and thousands of recipes. And this is not just, the gross out here, eat this cricket that I dry roasted, which I personally enjoy, but some people don't. It's really a thoughtful sort of incorporative, you're going to be dicing it up like you would, small pieces of meat. You can make stews. You can use them whole in things like a low country boil or a stew. Wow.
And so, it's really the limit is your imagination, right? If you kind of know how to season meat and you know how to use proper seasonings, you can do almost anything with these guys. Well, it'd be great to see people maybe shift to not relying so heavily on meat and industrialized farming of livestock for their food. But that's the ecologist in me. Chicken, beef, and pork are not going anywhere. They're going to be around, but the stark reality is our population is projected to hit 9 billion humans by 2050. We can't convert enough land over to livestock production. So we have to start thinking now about how to supplement, not replace, but supplement with other high quality nutritional proteins, because we simply can't bulldoze everything and make, huge livestock production facilities. We have other needs for that land, right? So, and we need insects for a lot of. Insects can be that supplement that we need to help us deal with that, so that we don't have 30 years from now food shortages leading to, even worsening conditions in terms of starvation and poverty, which we already have. They could be, many times worse by then. So insects are offering us sort of a way out, right? And with 10 quadrillion insects alive on Earth at any one moment, they're the most plentiful protein supply there is. Well, right. And they perform a lot of other ecological functions while they're around. And so if we could encourage people to diversify and incorporate insects, then maybe we can also, start to undertake practices that support the continued existence of all of these quadrillion 10 quadrillion insects on the planet, because a lot of the practices that we undertake are actually affecting insects very negatively around the globe. So speaking of getting people involved, one last thing, and then I promise I will let you go. You've been so generous with your time, and I can talk to you forever. So I may have to have you back, like I said. Anytime. It would be my pleasure.
I briefly mentioned the Cicada Safari map and citizen science and how people can get involved. Can you give us a little bit information so that people can join in if they want to?
Sure. Yeah. So the Cicada Safari app is you can actually just Google for Cicada Safari app, and you'll go to a website that not only shows you a live map of other citizen scientists as well as professional scientists that are using the app, but it's a great way to it's a gateway to sort of engaging about the natural world in a very non-obtrusive way, right? You don't have to actually catch the cicada. You just have to take a picture, count the number that you see in your backyard, and you upload the information. Your phone already has sort of the GPS coordinates. And so you're feeding into sort of our global map of where the brood is, how fast it's emerging, right? So because of the app, we already know that we've got a lot of adults already out in the southern portion of the brood because, it's warmer. It got warmer faster. That's pretty normal. But it helps us fill in gaps, right? We don't know necessarily that it doesn't exist in between the three, large pockets. And the app helps us. So we need as many people as possible, right? And the cool thing is you don't have to go hiking out into the middle of nowhere to provide data for this effort. You literally can just walk into your backyard, and if you see cicadas, you pull up the app, you upload, and you become part of this massive network of scientists and citizen scientists working together to fill in our knowledge gap on this emergence. And that is captured for all eternity, right? So, the next generation of scientists that are working on periodical cicadas will use data that you uploaded with your phone, with your kids in the backyard for their research, right? Yeah. And that's really important and really impactful. And I hope that it can serve as an example of other kinds of really great citizen science efforts to help us. Because let's face it, with a few thousand entomologists in North America, we can't be everywhere, right? Yeah. So we need help, right? We can do some of it with specimens in the collection, and we can do some of it on our own expeditions. But having everybody helping us out in this really easy use system will help us learn more about the natural world, and that's really what we're all about, right? So. Yeah. It's a great way for people to get engaged. It's a lot of fun. A lot of people have been really excited to be able to upload their numbers. So they're actually going in every day and, now I have 100 in my backyard. Now I have 300 in my backyard. It gets really addictive watching the map as it starts to fill in and will for the next year. And this is the last of the broods before we have a gap. We'll actually have a gap of 2 years. 2023 and 2022 and 2023 will be gap years where we won't officially have a brood emerge, and that's because two of them went extinct, right? So that's our gap. We had 2 disappear on us, and so but then in 2024 we'll have 2 broods out at the same time. So that's going to be a really exciting year, and that happens every once in a while. When we get a 17-year brood and a 13-year brood, and they happen to overlap because they're on slightly different cycles. So 2024 is going to be super exciting again, but this is going to be our last sort of big brood for a couple of years. So I hope people will join in. We'll go get the app. It's free. It's available on Apple and Android. So it's super accessible for almost anybody that has a modern phone. Help us out, help them out, and have a good time.
Yeah. Thank you for everything you're doing, Dr. Floyd Shockley, everyone. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I'm happy to come back anytime.
That was a lot of fun. Now, listen, some of you may resent the songs these cicadas are blasting en masse. And keep in mind, though, that people in earlier times revered the song of the cicada. Even before Plato's Phaedrus and Socrates' philosophy of divine communication through the cicada, these insects featured prominently as symbols of resurrection and rebirth, from the Hopi people of Arizona to the ancient Chinese civilizations. For the Hopi, the humpbacked flute player is a human form of the cicada, and it's often incorrectly attributed as Kokopelli, which is derived from a robber fly. not a cicada. If you want to help track cicadas, check out the Cicada Safari map. You can find the link in the show notes. Also, over 2 billion people worldwide regularly consume insects, bugs, and other arthropods. It's not a novelty, it's part of a nutritional diet. What food is high in protein, low in cholesterol, low in carbs, gluten-free, and doesn't take a lot of resources to cook or grow? And it's low in calories? Bugs, like the cicada. You can find a link to the cookbook also on the show notes, which you can find at www.jenniferverdelin.com, or you can head over to Wild Connection, the podcast hosted by Podbean. You can even now listen to the podcast on my YouTube channel, Wild Connection TV. So check out those notes and look for the links to the Cicada Sound Library, books and recipes, as well as how to connect with Dr. Floyd Shockley. If you're digging the show, subscribe and share it so others can too. Next time, we're going to talk to Dr. Stan Temple, who's a senior fellow for the Aldo Leopold Foundation. They are celebrating the 75th anniversary of Aldo Leopold's historic book, The Sand County Almanac, and the 100-year anniversary of the Gila Wilderness Area, a place that Aldo Leopold made a real contribution in getting designated as a wilderness area. So don't forget to tune into that episode coming up next time, and thanks for listening.